It's the 10% Happier Podcast. I'm Dan Harris. Hello, everybody. How we doing? One of the most common questions I get, especially from subscribers over on my Substack, is how do I go deeper into meditation? Specifically, how do I learn more about Buddhism? What is Buddhism exactly? What are the fundamental concepts? And how do I fit it into my everyday life? Up until now, I've not had a great answer. There are some books I like, of course, but especially in audio, there really hasn't been an easy solution for an on-ramp to Buddhism. Now, though, I have an excellent answer at the ready. Over on the Waking Up app, they just posted a 4-part conversation, roughly 8 hours in audio, featuring Joseph Goldstein, the eminent Buddhist teacher, Sam Harris, the neuroscientist, author, and podcaster, who is the proprietor of the Waking Up app, and me. In this audio extravaganza, Sam and I peppered Joseph with questions about all aspects of the Buddha's Eightfold Path. As you're about to hear Joseph explain in today's episode, the Eightfold Path is one of the foundational Buddhist lists. It's a kind of GPS for enlightenment. 8 crucial ways to train and orient your mind in meditation, in your worldview, and how you act in the world. Today, here on this podcast, we're going to play you the first part of this 4-part conversation. If you want to hear the rest of the sessions, as well as the guided meditations from Joseph that go along with those sessions, you need to download the Waking Up app. You can do so at wakingup.com/10%. That's wakingup.com/TENPERCENT. I'll put a link in the show notes. Just so you know, if you buy a subscription via that URL, you will get a 30-day free trial, and you will be supporting me and my team as well, because we will get a portion of the proceeds from any of the subscriptions generated through that link. And just to say, if money's an issue, Sam offers scholarships. That's the same policy that I have over on danharris.com. If you can't afford it, we'll give it to you. I want to give you a little context on this episode before we dive in. As many of you know, I recently went through a rather wrenching separation from what used to be known as the 10% Happier meditation app. In the process of this years-long divorce, I had many, many conversations with my great friend, Sam Harris, who was eager to have me make some content with him. So this is really the first content partnership experiment that we engaged in, and you'll be hearing a lot more about my relationship with Waking Up in the future. I think of Waking Up as a great complement to what I'm doing on Substack. If you're looking for a community vibe, a direct access to me, and the ad-free version of this podcast, go to my Substack. If you're looking for a traditional meditation app experience, I really think you can do no better than Waking Up. It's an amazing resource. Sam has recruited some of the best meditation teachers alive, including the aforementioned Joseph Goldstein. By the way, if you go to the app, you can also listen to an outstanding 30-part lecture series from Joseph that takes you even deeper into Buddhism. So again, check it out. wakingup.com/10%. I think you're going to really enjoy today's conversation. The three of us are old friends, so you're going to hear a lot of practical, actionable wisdom in here, but also a lot of laughs. We'll get started with Joseph Goldstein and Sam Harris right after this.
I just want to say at the outset how happy I am to be doing this with both of you. I mean, this is just like, had I dreamt it, this would be a dream come true. I mean, we just came together very quickly, as you both know, but it's just crazy good fortune to be able to do this with both of you. So I'm in very good company with you guys. So, but so I think the idea here, Joseph, was because you are 80 years old, which sounds impossible. And I've known you since you were
as well.
I've known you since you were 46. And I know that because you're exactly 23 years older than me, and I was 23. So I knew you were double my age at the time. We just want to get the most out of you, and we thought we would structure it based on the Eightfold Path, but obviously we can follow any other line that is of interest, but we just want to get Joseph Goldstein's wisdom mind right here in the present.
Just to say that I'm also really psyched to be here, and I was thinking about my/our good fortune on the walk over to this nice little cottage we're in, and I was remembering the conversation that started this. You and I were out to breakfast. I was in your state, and we were talking about what kind of work I could do with and for you. And you said, you and Joseph should go on a retreat. And then every afternoon, just record some audio and see what you get. And then there was a pause. He looked down and said, I have to be there.
Yeah. No, just the words came out of my mouth and the sentence wasn't finished. And I realized, wait a minute, what am I saying here? I'm giving away all the good stuff. So, yeah.
Well, I do like the phrase, see what you get. So we'll see what we get.
Yeah.
Meaning we could wind you up and we could end up,
who knows? Who knows?
Maybe start by telling us a little bit about what the Eightfold Path is.
Okay, so basically the Eightfold Path is really clear instructions of or about the path leading to awakening. And at one point, somebody asked the Buddha, are there still enlightened beings in the world? And his response was, as long as people are still practicing the Eightfold Path, there will be enlightened beings in the world. And so, pretty direct statement that it's a path, and it's a path that leads to someplace. And where it leads to is whatever we'd like to call it, enlightenment, awakening, freedom, liberation. But that's the power of this particular framework. And it's pretty interesting because the framework is not only about meditative insight. The Eightfold Path includes so much about just living wisely in the world. It's a beautiful framework to unpack.
Can I ask you a foundational question?
Yeah.
Because I think I've asked you this before, but I can't remember the answer, and I definitely haven't asked you recently. When Joseph says words like enlightenment and liberation, where do you, Mr. Skeptical Atheist, stand vis-a-vis all of that?
I mean, there's probably some translation required based on some of the doctrines in Buddhism, but I have a very grandiose picture of what is possible as far as the far reaches of human well-being. So enlightenment, there's an enlightenment-shaped, terminus to all these efforts that I'm totally happy to believe in because it's something that I think we can experience, we can sort of sample along the way too. So, we'll get into this topic at some point, but there are differences of opinion about what the final realization is. But if it were only a matter of stabilizing the thing that, many of us have experienced along the way, in my view, that, we could call that enlightenment or, realization or whatever you want to talk about it. I mean, it's so freeing psychologically with respect to what is normal, our default sense that it's many of the spooky sounding ideas in Buddhism, I think are just true, like the self being an illusion, say, that can become obvious and you can actually no longer overlook that obvious fact of the mind, and that there's a psychological freedom that comes with that. But enlightenment, as we know, also there are doctrines that are attached to it, like the enlightenment of the Buddha entails things like omniscience and magic powers, and that's where I begin to, I'm at worst agnostic there, but perhaps we'll talk about that spooky stuff as well.
I love the spooky stuff. Yeah. But I think there are 2 points worth making. One is the Buddha was very clear. Don't take anything I say at face value. Check it out in the laboratory of your own mind. I don't think those were his exact words, but it was roughly,
close enough.
Yeah, roughly speaking. So this is a tradition that skeptics, and I would count myself one of those, can, I think, safely explore. And then the second thing back on enlightenment is I believe the classical understanding of what enlightenment is the uprooting of greed, hatred, and delusion. If I have that right, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that's a pretty big claim.
Yeah, and I think that particular way of framing what enlightenment means, I think it's really useful because it's not abstract. It says very specifically what qualities in the mind which create suffering are uprooted when one is awakened or enlightened. Because often the Buddha would refer to what he teaches as being teaching suffering and the end of suffering. So that's really the bottom line. And he said that he knew much more about the nature of the world, the universe, perhaps the mysterious things. So his knowledge was vast. But what he taught was just that which led to the end of suffering. And so that becomes, I think, a really pragmatic measure for us to assess our own practice. Even all along the way. Are we suffering less or more? And it becomes pretty obvious through some degree of awareness and mindfulness and, meditative insight, that greed, hatred, delusion are causes of suffering. In generosity, love, wisdom, the causes of greater happiness. So this is not mystical, and I think it's easily verifiable in one's own experience all along the way. So that's why I like that particular frame. There are other more ways of understanding enlightenment that are not so easily verifiable for most people. So that's why this one, I think, really serves that purpose.
It might be worth saying a little bit about what suffering is, because I think to a lay ear that sounds like, oh, I'm chained to a rock and crows are pecking at my innards. But there's a pretty
there is that.
That's a flavor that is on offer if you find the right person to tie you up. But you talk about the constituent parts being greed, hatred, and delusion. Maybe just unpack that a little bit.
Well, in a way, those are two different questions, or they're related, but somewhat different. I came across online someplace, I don't remember where, for me, the perfect definition of suffering. And suffering is the translation of the Pali word dukkha. And it's not a very good translation, because generally we think of suffering when we're in pain, and so there's a very tangible aspect to suffering. But dukkha means something much greater. And the definition, which I have come to love because it feels so comprehensive, is the inevitability of unwanted experiences. The inevitability of unwanted experiences. And these unwanted experiences can take, many forms. And this particular phrase highlights some of the other insights of practice. Why is there the inevitability of unwanted experiences? Because everything is unstable. Everything is continually changing. And there's another phrase in the text, which, again, I've really come to love because it's a little unusual in English, but it just makes the truth of impermanence very vivid. It says, things always becoming otherwise. It says, in every moment, things are becoming otherwise. And because that's not a usual expression for us, when I first came across that, yes. And it really helps to remember that. Just a couple of examples. I could be going for a walk, and then, my knee starts to hurt. So now my first thought, becoming otherwise. So it's just a reminder, this is the nature. Things are unstable, they're changing, they're becoming otherwise. And so to have the idea that they should be stable, or they should stay the same way, is a cause of dukkha. So there's a lot. There's a lot in there.
Yeah, that cuts through a common misconception about what the Buddha taught, because many people think that the punchline of Buddhism is life is suffering, right? And as though everything sucks, and there's no acknowledgement of real happiness or pleasure. But at least in one sutta, I think it's the Mahamangala Sutta, where he talks about kind of a hierarchy of happiness, acknowledging that, having a healthy body is a form of happiness, having a healthy family is a form of happiness. But it's the instability of all that. If you're clinging, this connects to greed, hatred, and delusion. If you're trying to hold on to something that's intrinsically unstable, you just have to wait around long enough, and you will begin to feel the dissatisfaction of dukkha.
And likewise, if you're pushing away what's unpleasant, and you have aversion to it, that very resistance to it is suffering.
Yeah. Well, so maybe we can drill down on this point here a little more. How do you think of clinging in this spot? Clinging as the root of the problem.
This was an image that somebody on retreat, they came in for a meditation interview, and they were describing their experience. And they said, suffering is like rope burn. If you're holding on tightly to a rope and it's being pulled through your hand, the tighter you hold on, the more rope burn is there going to be. Well, the rope being pulled through one's hand is the truth of things always becoming otherwise. then the more we hold on tightly, the tighter we hold on, of course, it's suffering. It's painful. And so the release is really in letting go.
Mm.
There are a million images for this. Another one of my favorite images describes a monkey trap that they use in Sri Lanka, where they tie a hollowed out coconut to a tree, and there's a hole. They put some sweet food in the coconut with a hole big enough for the monkey to slide its hand in when it's open, but not big enough for it to withdraw its hand when it's in a fist. Okay, monkey comes along, smells the food, puts his hand in it, grabs the food, he's caught. The hunter's coming. He's getting frantic, perhaps. All we have to do, or she, is open hand, slip out, and be free. But it's a very rare monkey that can do that because of the force, the habit, the deeply conditioned habit of grasping to what's pleasant, holding on. So, so there are a lot of aspects.
So to link up to Dan's question earlier about the goal of all this and just how far it reaches, how far do you think the ordinary forms of suffering can be mitigated through this thing we're calling enlightenment or awakening? I mean, just what is, if you imagine, I guess we could throw out some terminology here because I'm sure it'll come up. A Buddha is the kind of the ultimate example of enlightenment historically within the teachings of Buddhism, but there are more minor examples, which in your tradition are called arhants or arhats, which have uprooted all the greed, hatred, and delusion, but then don't have all the magic
qualities associated with a Buddha. I think we can, the agnostic in me wants to table all of that, but come back around. But when you imagine fully untying the knot of clinging in yourself, what is that synonymous with in terms of suffering and the absence of suffering? Can you get surgery without anesthesia and that's just as good as an experience as any other? Or is there some, how do you think about it?
So there are a lot of different ways to think about it. So one image I like to use, if I'm thinking about the awakening of the Buddha, and I'm just projecting that, or the awakening of, an arhat, the fully enlightened being, but who's not the Buddha. One of the things that becomes obvious in our meditation practice, and I think this is true of everyone, is that we all find ourselves in a comfort zone of what's okay, what we can easily be with. And it could be feelings in the body, different emotions, thought patterns, whatever. We have our comfort zone. Then in the course of practice and vipassana, we come to the edges of our comfort zone. When we're just sitting and undistracted and not moving away from things, and not trying to avoid the edges. When we're just sitting and practicing being mindful, we get to the edges. Maybe it's a certain level of discomfort in the body. Maybe it's a really painful emotion. Okay, so we're at the edge, which is where we want to be in the practice. And this might be an interesting point to emphasize, that the point of the practice is not to avoid that. The practice is actually, it's of benefit when it leads us to that place, because then we can play at the edge and learn how to relax into whatever that experience might be without holding on to it and without pushing it away. And so we get to the edge, maybe discomfort or emotion. Okay, it's okay. It's okay. Let me feel it. And so we relax into it. We relax into that experience. And in that relaxation, we are seeing the impermanent, impersonal nature of it. And so our comfort zone gets a little bigger. That's now within our comfort zone. Go on, come to a few more retreats, to our practice. We come to another edge, go through the same process. And so I see the practice of freedom, the gradual process of it unfolding, is that we are enlarging our comfort zone. And my projection of the fully enlightened mind is a mind without edges. There's no edge.
Mm.
And so whatever it is that arises, the mind is relating to it from a place of greater freedom. So this is one way of...
Okay, can I ask you a question about that without derailing you? Or
As long as it's an easy one.
yeah, you seem to have linked seeing the impersonal, impermanent nature of phenomenon there with the expansion of the comfort zone. I'm not sure that's intuitive for everybody. I mean, how does seeing the impersonal nature of it? I guess people could understand how impermanence may give one a sense of more comfort because you see that, the moment something's there, let's say pain, it's disappearing, before you can even really make contact with it. But how is an insight into selflessness or the impersonal nature of phenomenon at all helpful here when you've got a pain in the knee?
Well, it is very different not taking it personally. And so I'll just give you an example, kind of in a meditative progression. Okay, I was sitting or walking, and all of a sudden my knee hurts. And very often the first reaction is, I don't like it. It's painful. My knee is killing me, right? Then in the course of meditation, it's like we drop underneath the level of the concept knee, because we actually don't feel a knee. There's no sensation called knee. So we don't feel knee. Knee is a concept which we're overlaying on a certain experience of certain sensations. The problem is that the concept reifies it, as if the knee is something stable, there, more or less permanent. So on that level of concept, we are not seeing the changing nature of what's really going on. So through the practice, even though our first reaction is, oh, my knee really hurts, but then with some understanding, we drop that and drop into the level of the elements, sensations, the tightness, the burning, the stabbing, the this and that. Right? As we drop into that level, not only are we seeing the impermanence of what's going on, it gives pretty direct access to at least a beginning understanding of selflessness, because while we might very easily go from knee to my knee, it's not very likely that we would go from vibration to my vibration, right? Or heat, my heat.
Yeah.
And so and in the more classical Buddhist teachings, those sensations are described in terms of, 4 basic elements, earth, air, fire, water, which is, a classical framework from those years. But actually, I've been told that there is a modern equivalent of those 4 elements. Solidity. What are the 4 states of matter? Plasma,
gas, liquid, solid.
Yeah. Even though earth, air, fire, water is kind of the ancient terminology. I think there is, that more modern vocabulary.
If you find any plasma in there, I'll want to hear about it.
Well, I'm not even sure what plasma is, but but anyway,
it's unlikely to be in your knee.
It's just that when we're on that level, it's not so likely to claim it as being I and mine. And that's why one of the key turning points in the meditation practice is when people gradually go from the level of their concepts about what's happening to the direct experience, whether it's of the physical elements or the mind elements, because it's on that level that we begin to see the impermanent, impersonal nature.
But do you think that all of the suffering of, let's say, physical pain here, because it's the most concrete, is a matter of the psychological resistance to it, born of aversion and clinging? Like a mind without any clinging in the presence of still an objectively, excruciatingly unpleasant sensation in the body. Do you actually imagine that to be a mind that is indifferent to those sensations compared to any other thing that's on the menu? Or is it just most of the suffering is reduced?
Yeah. So this may stretch most people's view of what's possible. But there is a story from the Buddha's time, which I'm a little hesitant to share because it seems so far out of the range of possibility for most people. But if we're willing to consider the possibility that a truly free mind may be experiencing things very differently than we do, it might give some indication. So after the Buddha was enlightened, he was walking around with the monks and the nuns, and he told them, he recounted a story from one of his previous lives when he was known as a bodhisattva, practicing. And he was a hermit living in the forest. And the queen of the country and some of her following, were walking through the forest. They came upon him and they were really interested in the teachings. And so he would be giving them teachings. Anyway, the king was very upset that his queen had gone off and become, a devotee of this hermit. And so the king, who was not a very nice fellow, ordered his guards or whatever to go the hermit. Here's where it gets a little gruesome, right?
We like to start all these sessions with stories of torture and
right.
dismemberment. So just feel free, Joseph.
But this is a story. I'm not making this up. So the king, ordered his guards basically to kill the hermit by sawing off his arms and legs. Pretty gruesome, horrible story. The Buddha, in his lifetime as a Buddha, now he's fully awakened, he's recounting this story. And he said something which can make one sit up straight. He said, even then, and he was not even yet fully awakened. He was a bodhisattva, working towards awakening. He said, even then, my mind harbored no ill will or aversion. And if you are truly following my teachings, you should emulate that. So that's a rather high bar.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, so even if we don't go to that extreme, which hopefully none of us will have to, but we can see it at work, even in more modest, when we're feeling pain and even quite intense pain, and this happens, I think all of us, have experienced that at times in our meditation, where it can get pretty painful. And seeing the difference in our own minds when we're contracted in the face of it, and when we can relax in the face of it. And so again, there's the famous example of the 2 arrows. Somebody shoots you with an arrow. The first arrow is the painful sensation. The second arrow is all the mental suffering we might add to the physical pain from the first arrow. So that's all the second arrow. And the Buddha is pointing out that it's the second arrow that we can really work with. The first arrow hits, it's painful. That's life.
Yeah.
But how we're relating to it is really up to us.
Might be worth saying, oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to take
Shoot,
out my...
Sam.
Yes. I need a third arrow, Joseph. Yeah. 2 is not enough, Joseph.
Just to get back to this term of letting go, I can imagine if somebody's listening to this and hearing the Dharma or Buddhism for the first or among the first times, the question could come up like, where's this heading? Like, does this mean I don't give a shit about anything? I don't try at work. I don't try in my relationships. What does letting go look like in practicality?
I think letting go, I don't think that's the best phrase, even though we use it a lot. But some time ago, I don't even know who first suggested it, but using the phrase letting be works for many people much better than letting go. Because when you hear letting go, oh, what am I supposed to do? And how do I let go? And it can feel complicated.
But also when something's unpleasant, it doesn't seem like you're holding on to it. It's not intuitive to say that letting go of this pain is, how do I do that?
Right.
But if you let it be, that's...
And the letting be works because in the letting be, we're seeing the changing nature. with seeing the flow. And so the letting go happens organically rather than by anything we're doing. So what was the question?
Joseph let go of even of your question.
Yeah, well,
Which happens quite a lot.
this is the mind without edges. So
Yes.
there are a lot of people, I would put myself in this category, who care about peak performance and achievement in various spheres of our lives. And so the idea of not clinging, letting go, maybe some further explication could help.
One of the problems in the transmission of Buddhism, but really anything else, from one culture to another, a lot of the problems come out of translation, linguistic translation. So the teachings that we've inherited in this tradition are basically in the Pali language, an ancient language of India, very related to Sanskrit, but the more vernacular version. And in Pali, it's a language that is very specifically geared in the way it was used by the Buddha and the teachers of that time. It has very specific vocabulary for the nuances of different mind qualities and factors and sensations in the body. So, for example, and when it's translated into English, very often it's not the same precision. So a very common example is the word desire, because often in the teachings, they will be interpreted as the Buddha says to let go of desire. And so this speaks to your question. What about desire for accomplishing things in the world or doing things in the world? The problem is that desire means a lot of different things, whereas in Pali, there are different words for each of those meanings of desire. So, for example, if there's desire to get ahead in the world, be number one, whatever, what's important, or the way of assessing the particular meaning of desire, as we're using that word in English, would be to really have a very good and clear sense of the motivation associated with it. Right. And so, I have a desire to be number one. Okay, well, what's that motivation? Is it greed? Is it ambition? Is it selfing in some big way? Or desire to get ahead? Desire to do good in the world? There's another word in Pali to describe the desire of wholesome motivations. Right? And so it really depends on what's going on in the mind, what's the motivation in some of the situations you described. People could be motivated a lot by greed and by self-aggrandizement and by, wanting to be number one. But there are a lot of people doing fantastic things in the world, motivated by compassion, motivated by love, and doing hugely effective work, which is very different than the other, even though in English we use the same word. So that's why it can get confusing for people, because generally in the Buddhist teachings, with a superficial reading, we might read, the point is to get rid of desire, but without drilling down into what that really means.
How does that relate to the concept of craving, though? So the desire for sense pleasure, or just having preferences between, like you don't like broccoli, you like chocolate, you want more chocolate. Is there an enlightened version of that, or does the non-clinging, non-craving goal that you're envisioning nullify those kinds of distinctions? I mean, this is, I think we've spoken about this before, but if you bring the Buddha to the breakfast buffet on Maui, does he not want anything? Does he not know what he wants more than any other thing? Is he like a catatonic that you have to move out of the line there? Or does he have all of the preferences that he had before his enlightenment, but they're just held in a very different psychological space?
First, I have to say that although I can understand your inclination to have me speak for the Buddha.
This is your job.
I do want to say that that's a little overreach. And so all I can do is express my limited understanding of what the Buddha mind would be like.
Right.
So,
this
is just to clean up my karmic, my potential karmic.
All right, but
having been said,
you win Buddhist plaudits for being humble in that way. But based on your experience,
I get the question.
You have an expectation of what freedom will seem like.
So,
right? So what will it seem like? And I bring you back to the breakfast buffet at the appropriate
I think it's pretty simple.
hotel.
From my current level of understanding, so I'm leaving the door open for future revision. It's not having preferences. It's not being attached to the preferences. So in this hypothetical Buddha going up to the buffet table, oh, sweet buns. I've been wanting, I've been thinking about sweet buns all morning. And then there are no sweet buns. They're serving broccoli fritters.
Yeah.
My imagination of the Buddha's mind is that it would not cause a ripple because there would be no attachment to the preference, even if there had been a preference.
Right.
And yes, I just want to reiterate that I really don't know whether the Buddha would have even had a preference or not, but I could imagine the scenario I just described.
Oh, so to come back to our starting point, when you envision the path of practice as being more and more the ability to expand the edges of our tolerance for dukkha on some level, why not play the game very differently? Why not just, if the final result is just not being attached to the falsification of one's preferences, why couldn't one practice keeping, the sweet buns within arm's reach as much as possible, but noticing those times where they're not available, and then that's the edge. But so, for instance, to bring this back to a pain in the knee, why not move mindfully every time there is a pain in the knee, being just as aware of that and the impermanence of all that, and all of one's efforts to be comfortable can be prosecuted with the full glare of mindfulness, presumably. So what failure mode do you imagine one's practice gets into there if one's constantly
just
feathering one's
as we're
nest?
beginning this conversation, I have to lay some ground rules. Don't string too many questions together, because the second one will push out the first. So I'll address the last one you mentioned because I already forgot the first.
It was part of the last contained the first. Yeah.
Okay, so there's discomfort in the body. Why not just move every time? There are different ways we could address that question, but kind of the one that comes to mind most readily is because given the truth of dukkha, the inevitability of unwanted experiences, so that's inevitable. That is going to come in our lives. And the fact that, yes, sometimes there may be a pain and we move and it goes away. But there will inevitably be times when we're experiencing pain in the body and moving is not going to make it go away. That is just the reality of whatever that situation is at the moment. So have we trained ourselves to be more accepting of that without resistance, without fear? Or when the pain is there and it's not going away and we don't have the option just to change position, to have it go away, are we going to be with that pain? Could be with a wide range of second arrows, of things that create even more suffering, of fear, of resistance, of depression, of rage. It could be a lot of different things. So it's an important training. And this is part of the training in practice, is to increase our capacity to hold what's pleasant and unpleasant equally with equanimity, because that's going to serve us in our lives of creating a life of greater ease, because things are always becoming otherwise and often out of our control. So I see it as just a really important training. And the Buddha talked about this, an example of this, and something that's found a lot in the suttas, where the Buddha would visit people who were sick and dying, and he would ask them, he would say, "Oh, I hope the pain is diminishing," and in that vein. And the person would say, "No, it's not diminishing. It's getting stronger and more intense." And they use some vivid images for that. And the Buddha's remark in almost all of these situations is, though your body is afflicted, may your mind remain unafflicted.
Mm.
So to me, that's one expression of the free mind.
Mm.
The body is going to be afflicted. It's the nature of the body. There's no getting around that, one way or another. But then this is the power, I think, of the teachings and the practice, is that we can actually train our minds over time, and increasingly so, not all at once, but even as the body is afflicted in one way or another, the mind remains unafflicted. And so this is the practice, and that's the purpose of working with pain when it's manageable. And even if we could move to alleviate it, we don't, at least for some time, to just practice. Okay, can I be with this? Can I relax into it?
Well, that actually builds a bridge to my next question, which is, we've been talking a lot about physical pain and the perhaps mitigation or total mitigation of attendant psychological suffering. But obviously, meditation is mostly thought of not so much as an antidote for physical pain, but for mental suffering in all its forms, most of which have nothing to do with your body being uncomfortable, right? So there's, the pain of sadness or disappointment or shame or, terror. I mean, there's all these psychological states which are a kind of ethereal pain. I mean, they do sort of map to the body, and we feel them in the body as unpleasant as well. But their status as forms of unpleasantness is somewhat hard to get a hold of, and yet they really are the basis of most of human suffering. The states we get into based on our thoughts about past, present, and future. And what I'm hearing is that basically all of that is optional. The real promise of meditation is, though the first arrow of physical pain is inevitable, the arrow of mental suffering in all its forms, certainly suffering based on your thoughts about past, present, and future, that is a dream from which it is possible to awaken. And that is, on some level, I think to the average person, no less grandiose a promise than the promise that you could have your legs cut off and be equanimous with that, right? So how do you think about mental suffering in this context?
Yeah, I mean, first to reiterate your point, the Buddha commented that actually mental suffering, I don't know if he used the word worse, but is much worse than physical suffering. And I think we know this because, at least in my experience, with physical suffering, even when it's intense, and maybe the mind is not perfectly equanimous, but in my experience, there's still a possibility of creating some sense of distance from it, which mitigates the suffering a bit of it. But when there's mental suffering, that often feels all pervasive. It often feels very hard to find some distance from it for an untrained mind. So it's in that sense, I think, that the Buddha said mental suffering is really more challenging than physical suffering. But the whole teaching is about how to free ourselves from that mental suffering. And there are just so many different specific ways, depending on what the particular mental suffering is. But one of the most transforming insights, which goes completely against our general conditioning. Okay, I just want to back up a minute. We started this conversation saying we were going to talk about the Eightfold Path.
Yeah, we haven't gotten to the first fold of the path.
So I just want to reference it, and then we can get back to it and then go deeper into it. But the first step of the Eightfold Path is right view. And we can go into a longer discussion. That itself is a huge discussion. There are a lot of elements to it. But I came across this one teaching which described one very common expression of wrong view. And it's the feeling, or it's the experience of, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm excited, I'm afraid, I'm depressed, I'm bored, I'm loving, da-da-da. Goes through a long list of all the different mind states. And of course, this is how we speak. And this is very often how we experience these things. Oh, I'm feeling happy. I'm feeling grief. So why is it wrong view? Because this is the common way we interpret our experience. The wrong view aspect is the claiming of that mind state to be self, to be I, which is so deeply embedded in our conditioning. So the relief from that suffering is as we begin to be mindful enough and aware enough of the emotions themselves as being impersonal, not I, not self. I can share a few stories, but first an image. There's one Tibetan teaching which says, thoughts and emotions wander through the mind like clouds in the sky, no roots, no home. Right? And I love that image. And then it's kind of amusing just to imagine the clouds going by with roots coming down from them, attaching them to the earth. It's a ridiculous image, right? And so clearly not the state of things. And yet that's what we're doing with these emotions. So an emotion or a thought, we're rooting them to the view of self, right? And that's what is problematic. And when we see them for what they are, they're more like clouds in the sky. The emotions arise when the conditions are there for it to arise. Just like a cloud arises when the conditions are there for it. The conditions change, the cloud disperses or becomes otherwise. Exactly the same way with our emotions, But what keeps us from seeing that ephemeral, we could say empty nature of the emotion is because of our identification with them. We're rooting them in this view of self. And our practice is to, I don't know if we want to say cut the root or, not be identified with them.
Can you say more about what identification is?
Yeah, so I'll just, from my own experience. So this goes back quite a few years, early on in my practice. The emotion that was most difficult for me, the afflictive emotion that I was working with a lot over years and years and years, was fear. So of all the unpleasant emotions that can come, for me, that was the one that was most deeply conditioned. And I'm working with it in a lot of different ways over years of my practice. And there were times when it was just so intense, particularly in the experience of intensive meditation. I would be sitting and afraid to stand up. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was completely irrational. There was nothing fearful about standing up, but that's what was going on in my mind. So two things, there are two aspects of what helped me free myself from rooting that fear, in myself. One was, and this is one of the most important, I don't know if teachings or changes in perspective that can really help to free the mind. So at one point I was doing walking meditation and the fear was there and it was strong. And I'm noticing fear, 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 fear. But it still felt really locked in. And then something happened in my mind, something shifted in my mind. And that shift was expressed in the thought, if this fear is here for the rest of my life, it's okay. So it's okay became my magic mantra about everything. It's okay to feel it. And what was so instructive about that was that I thought I had been mindful all along because I had recognized the fear. Yeah, fear. I was feeling it and noting it and recognizing it, but always through the filter of aversion. I wanted to get rid of it.
Right. Which technically is not mindfulness.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. So you're aware of it, but it's colored by your
aversion,
contraction around it. Or
Exactly. And so just highlighting the difference between recognition and mindfulness, or recognition and awareness. These are two different things.
So is it true to say that mindfulness contains equanimity? I mean, or presupposes equanimity, or co-arises with equanimity? Yeah.
And it was amazing when my mind had that shift. It's okay. Here for the rest of my life, it's okay. What was amazing is that whole mass of fear that had been lodged and locked in that moment, just washed through. It's like it was released from the grip of attachment. And it's not to say that fear never arises again, because it can still come up. But my relationship to it is completely different, because from that experience, it's okay. It's okay. So that's story number one. Story number two. I'm teaching in Texas with my colleague, Sharon Salzberg. We're going for a walk after lunch, and I'm going on. And I think this was before the experience I just described. I'm going on and on. Oh, I have all this fear, and it's so deeply conditioned. I'm going to need 30 years of therapy to unwind this. And I was going on. I was building a whole superstructure of self on top of this emotion. I'm such a fearful person, da, 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 da. And Sharon just turned to me and said, Joseph, it's just a mind state. And you know how when the conditions are right, somebody can just say a few words. Oh, yeah, it's just the mind. What are you creating this whole big self story about it? And so that's another, by the acceptance and then seeing the impersonal, selfless nature. It's just like a summer thundercloud. It's there and it's intense, and then it passes away. So our relationship to kind of the emotional suffering that you described, there is every potential to free ourselves from the contraction of them. However, some is very deeply, deeply conditioned from a lot of different causes. For those emotions that are not just kind of more typical ones passing through, but the deeply conditioned patterns, first, it may take some time. As it did with me for fear, I was working with this for years until that kind of change of understanding. But I think also particularly people who've had traumatic background, so there's some deep emotional conditioning, and it may take different modalities to help loosen it up, right? Very often just the therapeutic approach is really valuable, and sometimes the meditative approach, and sometimes a combination. So it's not to think that there's one way that is going to serve in all situations. So it's good just to have an open mind to say, okay, what will be most helpful?
But is that actually the claim, or would it be true to say that real mindfulness is always the right answer psychologically? Or are you saying that there are people for whom, given their conditioning, given the sources of their suffering, even real mindfulness is not an appropriate remedy? So you see what I'm getting at? Some people, you might be saying that some people, try as they might, won't be able to use the tool of mindfulness because of the nature of their suffering. They have to do something else. But are you saying that actually, in many cases, mindfulness is just not good enough?
No, I'm saying that depending on the intensity and the level of the conditioning, people's capacity
to even get to near mindfulness.
To be really mindful in the way that we've been describing.
Right.
Without attachment, without aversion, without identification.
Right. It's asking too much.
Yeah, it may not just at that time. the capacity might not be there. And very often it's necessary to go into the content to try to, okay, well, what are the causes? What's the history? And that begins to loosen things up enough so that maybe one could then apply mindfulness directly to the emotion.
The phrase to not be identified with thought, I think for many people is very hard to parse. And many people also assume that the goal is to be without thought, right? It'd be worth getting to that territory someday.
Yeah. We might naturally get there through right view.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it's actually been really helpful to kind of set the table in this way. And I know we'll want to work through the list, the Eightfold Path, but at least one last question for me, if I may. You talked a lot about the potential for freedom, the mind with no edges, and maybe I'm alone in this, but I think some non-trivial percentage of listeners are going to ask the question, well, how far can I get? How many lifetimes does this take? How much meditation do I need to do in order to get like a taste of, the anesthesia-free surgery, et cetera, et cetera? So what say you?
Well, so I do have a new favorite definition of enlightenment, which is lightening up. The whole process is about lightening up, which I think in a colloquial sense, we all have a sense of. It's not taking ourselves so seriously. And we just are with things in a simpler and easier way, that our minds start to decondition some of the complicated and suffering causes responses to things. So I'll give you another very mundane example. The fruit of the practice of integrating the wisdom of impermanence really into how we're living our lives. So it's just a totally normal, ordinary situation with a bunch of friends. And it goes back to actually what you was asking Sam about preferences. And do you have preferences? You don't have preferences. And this happens to me a lot. Can be with a group of friends, planning to go out to dinner. Where do you want to go? Oh, I want Thai, I want Chinese, I want this, I want that. And for the most part, and even though, I, like everyone else, has preferences, but for the most part in that kind of discussion, it really doesn't matter to me at all, because I know from experience that 10 minutes, 5 minutes after the meal is done, it will not have made the slightest bit of difference. Right? And so having just experienced that over and over again, why get into a fight? And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but why get into a fight over which restaurant we go to? So again, that's a very trivial example, but one could extrapolate that. And so the lightening up aspect of becoming enlightened is a process that I think starts wherever we are. And everybody, who really undertakes the practice in a somewhat consistent way, I think will experience this sense of lightening up, which is it's wonderful, when we don't take ourselves so seriously. And so there's a lot freer energy, kind of with dancing with things more than fighting with things or struggling with things. So this is a very kind of, we could say, secular or mundane understanding of the process, And then, of course, it goes into many more profound aspects of what awakening means. But I think it gives an indication of what's possible for everybody. We're all moving along on this trajectory, and we're all somewhere along the path. And
if we're practicing.
Yes. And for almost all of us, there's more to do.
Yeah. Hey, you've known this guy for decades. Is he lighter?
He still cares what restaurant we go to.
I was thinking that same thing.
I don't remember getting my free pick of cuisine every time I'm with Joseph.
Is he lighter though than when he was 46?
That's hard to say. I don't know. I mean, he was pretty light at 46. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been hanging out with him.
I can definitely answer the question.
Yeah.
much more so. So,
Yeah.
so just as an example, which you probably saw, as you mentioned, one of you mentioned, recently turned 80, and so IMS, our meditation center, put on a kind of an online 80s celebration, and somebody produced it, and it was really a lovely event. The woman who produced it, Lily Cushman, she dug up an old video of me teaching at Naropa in 1974.
Yeah.
So I had just come back from India, so I was a new teacher, and I was leading.
It's a very big difference in new and old Joseph teaching. Yeah.
Yes.
That's hilarious.
I mean, in that video, the teaching was the same, but I was so serious and so, it was like, there was not much.
Practically Burmese.
Not much lightness there. But there was a trajectory from that to how I feel now. Yeah. And to me, it's really noticeable in how I feel. I feel a lot lighter and more relaxed in teaching and in most things. So I think it really is possible, even just on that level.
But is that actually the right way to measure things? So again, coming back to the goal and what you imagine to be, the final fruition of practice, would you expect every arhat or every Buddha to show up with the same kind of lighthearted attitude? Or because again, the obvious examples, someone like Mahasi Sayadaw, who, whether he was an arhat or not, was obviously an exemplar of taking the practice, quite some ways. And some of this could have been cultural, some of this could have been how, he decided to behave in the role as a teacher, but I never met him. I obviously only met his student U Pandita, but there was a very kind of formal, serious, I don't even think they smiled very much. I saw U Pandita smile, but it's like even smiling was kind of taboo in the role of a teacher. I think they put their fans up to hide their smiles, but I don't know whether Mahasi ever smiled, but he was not the jolly teacher that, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is, right? So how much are you expecting a person's personality to change based on stabilizing this?
Obviously, people are going to manifest very differently because of just their innate personalities, and just with reference, for example, to Mahasi Sayadaw, what I've heard is certainly in his public persona, he was pretty serious, which is very Burmese culture, for monastics to present in that way. But what I heard was that when he was just in the equivalent of the back room,
he's a wild man.
Well, I wouldn't say wild man, but that another whole side of him came out.
Right.
So it's hard to judge, in what you're asking about without seeing somebody in the fullness of the situations. But I think the deeper part is not so much the personality expression, but this is more subtle and sometimes hard to assess, but really how empty of self someone is, and to some extent we really can feel it. We know when, even the English expression, very full of themselves, when somebody is very full of themselves, it's apparent. Mahasi Sayadaw was one of the emptiest of self beings that I've ever met. So that's really the deeper meaning of that, of lightening up. Lightening up in that way is the more profound aspect. It's kind of the personality. For me, it was very noticeable, that more superficial level. It was very apparent to me that that's what happened, along with, the deeper letting go of selfing to whatever extent.
Actually, I think it's an important point of confusion, because just as consumers of the teachings, I think people can be misled by the personal characteristics of teachers. There are people who have lots of charisma, who are very comfortable in front of audiences. They're very energetic. They're super positive. They've got a very high baseline level of happiness. And I won't name any names, but there are people who check all those boxes, but there's an 800-pound gorilla of an ego right at the center of it that is palpable, but it's not palpable in the sense of that they seem to be suffering or they seem to be neurotic. at least not when they're functioning well. They can be very, again, charismatic and outward focused, they can be performing impeccably, and yet it's not the same thing as absence of self. But that you could point to that person and say, that person's very light. They're laughing, they're smiling, they're very entertaining, they're very attractive of people's attention. They could be great performers. They could be great stand-up comedians or just performers in all kinds of modes. And yet there's a kind of self-actualization that has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think people might think that if I could only untie the knot of self through meditation, I would be like, Jamie Foxx, right? Like just free to dance and sing. And so
I think one of the, I don't think this is really a...
I don't think there's a common misunderstanding. That
Yeah,
you're somehow optimizing the personality through this practice.
I don't think it's really a critical point. But now I will make a critical point.
Thank you for getting us back on track.
Yeah. I think this is one of the really beautiful things about practicing with different teachers, because when you practice with different who you really respect and feel have a lot of wisdom, and you see them manifesting through many different personalities, that is a great teaching. Is that in that there's no one way to be. It's not that there's one persona that is going to manifest as we become freer or more awakened.
But what have you have made of the examples of teachers who can seem to be angry, right? So like one way of describing the path is to get rid of disturbing emotion like anger. Surely you've seen some great teachers seem to get annoyed or angry or frustrated or something. And so do you just view that as synonymous with them not being done? Or is there a way of actually displaying, in the same way that you could reach for the mango as opposed to the papaya at a buffet, and that's not tantamount to unenlightened craving, that's just a conditioned preference that need not mean anything. Could you see someone, I remember, so for instance, we were with Tukurgan in Nepal, and we had bought a bunch of Buddha statues and bells and other artifacts for him to bless, and so, but he was keenly interested in where we bought this stuff and how much we paid for it. And when he heard what one thing cost, I think it was a bell, or he looked horrified. It's like we tourists had just been shamefully taken advantage of it, and paid 10 times too much for something. And he was clearly, by outward appearances, he seemed to be annoyed or something. Now, if you sample your impression of what it's like to be him at that moment, is it just, okay, he's lost in thought in exactly the same way that any ordinary person is lost in thought and he's contracted? Or can that variation show up in even a totally free mind? What are you expecting? Again, you think this is not, you don't think a person's conception of the goal is important?
I think in the example you're giving, you would really have to know what was in his mind, and, there is this expression in Tibetan, wrathful compassion, where people manifest in what could be called a wrathful way, but actually the motivation and the energy is one of compassion, and one could say compassion to help wake people up, or where they see that as the skillful means in that particular situation. And it's very hard to judge, like in the example you gave. I don't know what was in his mind. As you were telling the story, I interpreted, but of course this was just my projection of, I could well imagine going there with our tchotchkes, Buddha tchotchkes, and his reacting with disbelief that anybody could be so stupid.
That was not they're very indulgent of that kind of thing.
I'm just saying that it could be there could be just a whole range of what was in his mind, and so.
Okay, but you do judge. This is, first of all, the wrathful wisdom, and every variant of that, while possibly psychologically true, that's a get out of jail free card for every guru who's ever exploited the role of guru. So like we know it's hard to actually know that you found that when you seem to have found that. And when the effects are obviously not good, you do judge. When you hear that Sogyal Rinpoche is just beating people up, you basically wash your hands of him as an example of what the Dharma is supposed to be, right? Like there's a line that somebody crosses, and in the literature we accept these stories that we would never accept in real life, right? Like the disciple holds up his finger, and who is it, Bodhidharma, or who cut off the finger?
Some Zen teacher.
Right. So it's like, if you're cutting off the fingers of your students, you're not going to survive long in the current Dharma circles, and for good reason. But it is thought that everything potentially could be skillful means in the
I think that's a misunderstanding, a misconception, and it's one of the reasons why in most Buddhist traditions, although there's some variation of how it's held or how it's expressed, but how the foundation of the whole journey is ethical behavior, the ethics of non-harming. And to me, that's why that foundation is so important, because people in teaching roles can so easily rationalize behavior as if they have in some belief, well, I've had this realization or I've had this level of enlightenment or whatever, so that everything I do, therefore, is expressive of that. That's the get out of jail free card. But that is dissociated, and it's dangerous. And we've seen lots of examples in spiritual scenes where people in teaching roles end up sometimes doing really unskillful, harmful things.
And frankly, it feels like we've seen that more in traditions that have this teaching around crazy wisdom or wrathful compassion. I mean, like we've seen less of it, I think, in the Theravada. I'm sure it exists.
Yeah. Well, that's also because, like in this tradition, there is a lot of emphasis on the teaching of ethics, of non-harming. I mean, and in different traditions, I think it's there in all the traditions. But in some it's really emphasized more than in others, and from my perspective, I think that's why it's really important to emphasize it, because it provides a place of safety. And in fact, one of the gifts of following the basic precepts of non-harming, and I love this expression, it talks about when we are committed to these precepts of ethical behavior, of non-harming behavior, we are giving the gift of fearlessness to everyone we meet, because we're saying with our behavior, you need not fear me. I'm not going to harm you. And the precepts are basic. It's not like, we have to go off and become saints in order to follow the precepts. They're pretty basic ways of behaving. But sometimes, if those teachings are not emphasized, teachers can go astray. Even teachers who may have some level of realization, but then misinterpret the extent of it and then think, oh, well, I've had this realization and everything I do is enlightened behavior. That's a real danger, and it has happened. We've seen it.
Yeah. It's a good segue to the Eightfold Path.
Yeah, I was going to say. So should we start marching our way through this list?
Yeah.
Coming up, Joseph and Sam talk about generosity, the importance of faith, and in this context, faith has a little bit of a different meaning, the wisdom of don't know mind, and various kinds of right view. So the first entry on the list of 8 is right view. We talked about it a little bit, but let's go deeper. What does it mean, technically, right view?
So one kind of general way, I think, of understanding, in the most general way, right view sets the direction of our path, right? So it's like having a right view of the path and the goal. That sets a direction. So if we're on a journey and we know the right direction to get where we want to go, then if we keep walking on that path, we will inevitably get there because we're going in the right direction. If we're going in the wrong direction, we can be making all kinds of efforts in our practice, but it's not going to get us where we want to go. And so that's why the Buddha said that, and he started the Eightfold Path with right view, and he said he sees nothing so conducive to the well-being of people as right view, and nothing as detrimental to the well-being of beings with wrong view. Because right view keeps us going on the direction of awakening, of freedom, of liberation, whatever word we want to use. Wrong view takes us away from that. So the setting of the direction is one way of understanding it, a way of taking a deeper dive into the meaning of right view and what it means to be setting the direction and how that manifests in our lives. There are two levels of it. And this is pretty interesting, I think, because it shows the comprehensive nature of the Buddhist teachings and how it touches so many different aspects of our lives. So the first level of right view is called sometimes mundane right view or worldly right view. And it has to do with the right view for developing greater ease and happiness in our lives. Not necessarily have to do with awakening or liberation, but just how do we live wisely in a way that reduces suffering, creates more ease, and basically aligns us or puts us in harmony with the way things are, rather than being out of sync with the truth of things. So there are a few elements of mundane right view, and they all circle around one crucial aspect of the Buddhist teaching. And that is the understanding that our actions have consequences. And in traditional Buddhist terms, this is talked about as the law of karma. That all of our volitional actions will bear fruit at some point or another, depending on the motivation associated with the action. So this is just central to the Buddhist teaching. So he said when we act motivated by greed, or motivated by aversion, hatred, motivated by delusion, that is like planting the karmic seed of some future unwanted experience. And likewise, when we act motivated by generosity or by love, by understanding or wisdom, that is planting the seed of some future desirable experiences. And this is such a powerful teaching in my mind, because when we understand it and explore it on deeper and deeper levels, it gives us a lot of agency in our lives. Because we're all conditioned in a lot of different ways. We have naturally a lot of wholesome, skillful motivations in our mind, but not completely. We have a lot of unskillful and unwholesome motivations. I think mostly in the moment of taking an action or performing an action, for many people, we are not considering the karmic consequences of the act. We're just carried along in the busyness of what we're doing and in the reactivity of what's going on, and we just act without necessarily really taking the time, the few moments to look into our motivation. Okay, where is this act coming from? Where is it leading? And do I want to go where it's leading? So when we have this understanding of right view, mundane right view, that actions bring result, that karma is unfolding lawfully, that can align us on a path of happiness. We can start doing those things which will bring desirable karmic results in our lives. So it's a powerful teaching. Now, here's where we may be getting into a little of the more mysterious aspects of the teachings. First, we can get a pretty clear sense of how karma unfolds just based on our own experience. And there are so many simple examples of this. Generally, when we're loving and basically have goodwill towards people, how do we find people relating to us? Generally, they like to be with us. How do people respond if we're full of anger and, hatred and judgment? How do people relate? Probably not so friendly. There is a karmic result in this very simple, mundane way. There's an effect of our actions. So we want to pay attention to that. Now, in the full scope of the Buddhist teachings...
Actually, before you go to the full scope, you could also just add that whether or not we're getting immediate feedback from the world, the difference in intentions feels a certain way at the level of our own minds. I mean, it just feels much better to be loving than to be angry and hateful and impatient.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I wrote a chapter in a book once called The Self-Interested Case for Not Being a Dick.
Right. Yeah.
And I just see that. I see that so often in my own life.
Yeah.
That whatever the external results are, the internal results are really powerful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good point, guys.
Okay. Back to you.
Now you're going to launch into the stuff that will make Sam's head explode.
That's all right. I'll be very mindful of my
Okay, but before I do it, there were a couple of other points mentioned in Mundane Right View.
Yeah.
I just want to put in before. One is, and this is right out of the texts, but it's all related to karma, emphasizing the value of generosity as a behavior to cultivate. Not only because it feels good in the moment, but it has very good karmic consequences. And so there's one little exercise I do. I really took that seriously. When I understood that, this is part of Right View, I really started making generosity a practice, not just, that's a good thing to do and, wait for it to happen. So the practice I've done, which I really has been transforming in a certain way, and I like to recommend it to people because it's been so uplifting for me, is that when I have a thought to give, I just practice doing it. I don't second guess myself. I don't, should I, shouldn't I? Is that too much or whatever? If the thought comes, do it. And it's been amazing. And so I'm not, in this particular practice, and there are many ways to practice generosity, in this particular practice, I'm not looking for situations. It's just I'm responding to my own impulse. When the impulse arises in my mind, okay, do it. And it's been amazing. And the range of what the impulses are huge. Sometimes it's a really small thing. Just some gesture of friendliness or, really simple thing. Sometimes the thought maybe to give something really big, way out of what even would be conventionally, people are you crazy? So there's the whole range of the kind of impulses. And I just found I've never regretted it, and it always brings joy. And so I just put this out as one example of a practical way of cultivating that mindset, that it can be a practice. Okay, so generosity is included in the description of Mundane Right View. A second aspect, which this one can get complex, because the Buddha emphasized the karmic responsibility we have to our parents, right? And so the classic image that's used, the Buddha said, we could carry our parents around on our shoulders for our entire lifetime and not repay the debt of them having brought us into this world. Okay, so that's a pretty powerful exhortation. I don't know how it is in other cultures, but certainly in the West, sometimes relationships with one's parents can be very complex, or fraught in one way or another. So I realize there's a lot of complexity to this. But I think it's good to keep in mind as something to strive for. Even if the relationship is difficult or challenging, just to hold it in some way of recognizing that there is a karmic connection, and in whatever way we can, to try to establish a wholesome, skillful relationship to our parents. And sometimes, I would say mostly it's possible, but there are some situations where, for this life anyway, it doesn't seem to be possible. But I just want to tell one story from teaching. Every year, as you know, we teach a 3-month retreat at IMS. And we've been doing it now for almost 50 years. So there was one meditator who came to many, many, many 3-month courses. I don't know how many, but a lot. 10, 12, 15, every year they would be coming. And the core psychological issue for this person was this incredible conflict with her mother. And so a lot of the meditation, year after year after year, come in for the meditation interviews, and it would be around that issue. And it seems so stuck. So it's just every year for years. And these are 3-month retreats. And, other things were happening, but this remained a core knot. And then it was amazing. 1 year she came, and somehow the whole knot had begun to release. And she reestablished the connection with her mother and opened up a channel of communication. And to me, it was really inspiring, to see that even when something is so deeply conditioned or knotted, just with patience and perseverance, even these deep knots can begin to unwind. And my first teacher, Munindraji, said something which can be a huge help for people on the path. And it was a real help for me, and this story illustrates it. He said, on the spiritual path, time is not a factor. But we, especially in the West, we're in such a hurry. We want results now. But this path is not like that. It takes time, and time is not a factor. If we're doing the practice, and this is where right view, setting the right direction. If we're on the path, going in the right direction, in whatever method we use it, but if right view has set the direction, then time is not a factor. We just keep walking, and the path will unfold.
Didn't Munindra also say, the thought of your mother is not your mother?
He did, and sometimes that works. It didn't work for this particular person until way down the road.
Got it.
Because the reactivity was just so strong to begin with. Okay, so there's the generosity, there's the relationship to one's parents, the part of extending this scope of right view, mundane right view. The Buddha talked about karma not only playing out within this lifetime, but playing out over many lifetimes. So, of course, this has to do with the whole idea of rebirth in different planes of existence, which for most people is outside the realm of their personal experience. And in the West, it's not even part of I'm not sure if I'm going to be using this word correctly. It's not part of our zeitgeist. Is that, we have a very, the way we understand things generally in this society, generally, not completely, but it's basically a scientific paradigm, of how we understand the world. Rebirth doesn't really fit into that. And so quite naturally, people either are skeptical or just disbelieve it, or, oh, this is just, some superstition from 2,600 years ago. So there's a lot of, at best, skepticism about this whole idea of rebirth.
Also, a lot of people come from an alternate religious paradigm, which is just as spooky, but it's different.
Right.
There is...
Right.
There's an after-death condition, but rebirth is not part of the story. So it's, that serves as a counterpoint. I mean, the people who get who leave that behind them and move into a proper secular physicalist worldview then see this Eastern variant on offer, and it's like, why would I adopt that one, having left the God of Abraham?
Yeah. No, that's all part of it, and why this particular aspect of the teachings is often not easily either understood or believed. And for myself, I certainly didn't begin this with any belief. I didn't know anything about Buddhism. I didn't know anything about rebirth or karma. Or I studied Western philosophy, in college, and that was my background. But over the many years of practice, I can track the trajectory of how I slowly became more open to considering it. And there's an expression, a phrase, and I think it was by the poet Coleridge. He used the expression, the willing suspension of disbelief, because we can be attached to our disbeliefs as well as attached to our beliefs. And so with something like rebirth, I think for many people, the most honest answer would be, I don't know. I don't know. It's not in my experience, but in the I don't know, that's very different than saying it's not true. And this goes back to the connection to right view. To say it's not true is wrong view in the Buddhist context. To say I don't know is not wrong view. And I don't know is actually more accurate as a description of our current state, unless one has had a definitive experience one way or the other. And so I think that's a very good way to hold many aspects of the teachings which are beyond our current level of understanding. It's to acknowledge that, okay. And for me, part of what led me to be open to these, there were many things, but one is, well, so much of what the Buddha said, we can verify. I can see, come and see, and he says, don't believe, check it out. And so much of what he said, checked out, oh, that really seems true. That works. I'm suffering less. And so for me, it tended, well, he was right about so much. But there's just the possibility he might be right about this too. So again, it's not even going to belief in it, but to be open to the possibility.
I know a guy, he wrote a book called The End of Faith. I'm very curious to hear what he has to say about all of this.
Again, I think I am genuinely agnostic about this, which is the I don't know state, but I think I detect in you more belief than mere, this is not truly in the shape of a mere question mark for you. I mean, for me, I honestly would not, given certain experiences I've had in meditation and on psychedelics, and given the logic you just gave of, these esoteric teachings have been right about so much that's counterintuitive, the fact that they are traditionally framed with this metaphysical worldview, maybe that gives some credence to the whole picture as opposed to taking it a la carte. But so for me, it really is, I just recognize I don't know. Like I actually, it's the absence.
That's a good step.
Yeah. But I believe
Here we go.
with all your lightheartedness, where you're busy not picking restaurants, you have moved further in the direction of a positive commitment to it being true psychologically.
No, the way I describe my own sense of it is that I'm inclined to believe, but always with the addendum, and I don't know. So I am inclined to believe for a whole variety of reasons, some of which we talked about. So that gives some energy to the inclination, but I can rest pretty easily, as I do rest easily, in acknowledging that I don't know.
Right.
And I think that for me is a really skillful way to hold it.
Well, two questions. Do you think anything important hinges upon having a positive belief in it, or something more than I don't know? And do the teachings say that something important hinges upon accepting these statements about the bigger picture to be true?
I think that the inclination to incline to it, even if one doesn't know,
to act as if it's true. And so it's almost like Pascal's wager in some sense.
Yeah, it is like that. In my experience, it tremendously supercharges the practice.
You're more motivated to practice.
Yeah, because the consequences are huge. If it is true, the consequences are huge, because then it's realizing, that as karma unfolds, and we'll be experiencing the fruit of our skillful and unskillful actions, it's not that it just ends with this life, that within this other framework, it extends over countless lifetimes. And so then the import of our actions takes on much greater significance, even though it's significant even within this one lifetime. But if you consider, this action may have ramifications for many lifetimes, maybe I should take care with my actions. This is important, this is significant. So, however you want to express it, like considering the possibility or inclining to believe, or however one frames it, with the recognition that one still doesn't know, I think for me it's just made the practice so.
You're acting as if it's true. You've decided to act as if it's true.
Yeah. And to my mind, with very good consequences.
Right.
And I don't see any discernible downside to it, because it's like a reinforcement for doing what's skillful and for doing what's wholesome, and for what brings happiness. So Munindraji, he had this great line. So he was talking more, future lives and other planes of existence, the lower realms and the higher realms and the heaven realms. And he loved talking about the heaven realms. He would just go on. And I loved hearing about them. A lot of people were very skeptical, but I was in that space. That sounds nice. But he would always end these little talks. You don't have to believe this in order to awaken, in order to become enlightened. You don't have to believe it. It's true, but you don't have to believe it. So that was always his last comment. So all of this is mundane right view, because it's the right view of how to live with greater ease and greater happiness in our lives.
Coming up, Joseph and Sam talk more about right view and some practical tips for cultivating right view.
The second part of right view is be called super mundane right view, or the right view of liberation. And this right view has to do with the essential aspects of the Buddhist teachings formulated in the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path. So right view is really learning about and experiencing, to whatever level we can, the truth of dukkha, the inevitability of unwanted experiences, right? The underlying cause of this round of rebirths is craving. And craving is the desire that keeps the whole machine going. And then the end of craving is the release. So I want to give an example of how we can move this from some abstract Buddhist philosophy to how, to some extent, we can experience it right in our own lives. For a long time in my practice, being familiar with the Four Noble Truths, and that liberation is the end of craving, clinging, grasping. In my mind, it was always, okay, I'm practicing, and someday, some years, somewhere down the road, I'll come to the end of craving. But it didn't seem very immediate to me. There was still plenty of craving that I could see in my mind. And then at a certain point, it was so interesting. I was just sitting, I was on retreat, and I realized I don't have to wait till the final end of all craving. I can practice non-craving in the moment and really see the effect of it. And so one way of doing that, and I really suggest this to people in their practice. So suppose you're sitting, and then some craving, some desire comes up in the mind, and it could be anything. It could be craving for food, or a sexual fantasy, or some ambition one has, some craving, that's going on. So if it occurs to one, to just be mindful of that mind state of wanting, which we're in the middle of at that time. We can feel ourselves wanting whatever it is. And then, because of the truth of things always becoming otherwise, at some point, the wanting is going to go away we don't have to do anything to make it go away. Mm-hmm. If we're just hanging out with it and watching, it's there, wanting. And at a certain point, it's going to disappear. Right in that moment, it can be so illuminating of the difference in the quality of the mind, of the wanting mind, and the mind that's free of wanting. In that transition, right from moment to moment. And my experience, and almost everybody who I've talked to about this, in the moment of the wanting disappearing, it feels like it's being let out of the grip of something. It feels that sense of release, that sense of ease, that sense of peace. So it can be in a very ordinary kind of wanting, so it doesn't have to be some big mystical experience. It's just watching our minds when it's filled with that kind of craving or wanting, what it feels like, the suffering of it, and then the release from it. And so we can really get a sense of this more super mundane right view, the understanding of the Four Noble Truths, that the end of craving leads to freedom, leads to peace, to greater ease. So I think that understanding, even if it's not complete, craving will come back again, but we have had a taste genuinely in our own experience. So it's not just some abstract philosophic statement that we need to believe.
Just to sum this up, the mundane right view is understanding that actions have results, what leads to what. Super mundane right view is to understand that awakening or liberation is possible, and the root of all of the opposite, the root of suffering, is craving. Yes. Am I in the zone of accuracy here?
Yeah. No, that's right. There's one other aspect that's included in right view, which is related to this, but it's just highlighting one particular aspect. And that is, and there's some kind of little bit of technical language, Buddhist language, that does need a little unpacking, what you asked about before, Sam. Mm-hmm. It's called freeing oneself from, sometimes it's called identity view or personality view. And it really has to do with the experience of selflessness or non-self. And so you asked before about, okay, well, what does it mean not to be identified with a thought? Mm. So there are different ways we can explore this. And some of them are really, to my mind, really interesting. So one of the simplest ways, but doesn't necessarily get right to the heart of it, but it's the beginning of getting to the heart of it, is just seeing both that we don't invite our thoughts to come. It's not like we're saying, okay, I'm going to think this now. Although
you can invite.
No, we can in this, but most of the thoughts that are going through our mind are uninvited. And so just even seeing that begins, where did these come from? And sometimes I'll suggest to people on retreat, why don't you just treat each thought as if it's coming from the person next to you? Just as a way of maybe getting a flavor of not being identified with them as one's own. And so seeing the impermanence of them in that way. But even more interesting to me, and I often suggest people do this in their practice, especially when there are a lot of thoughts arising in the mind, as the thoughts are there, to ask the question, what is a thought? Not what is the thought saying, which is what we usually do. What's a thought? And then people would tell the content, the story of it. This is different. This is, I don't know if this is the right word, it's more phenomenological. What is a thought as a phenomenon? And what I find incredibly amazing is that when we look directly at it as we're having a thought, but with that question, there's almost nothing there. Yeah. It's little more than nothing. It's so ephemeral, so empty of any substance. But what's so amazing is that when we don't see the thought in that way, they have such tremendous power in our lives. I call them the little dictators of the mind. Thoughts go here, go there, do this, do that, get married, get divorced, whatever. It's like our thoughts are driving us. And yet when we look to see what a thought actually is, it's little more than nothing. So that to me is so extraordinary to see that, and seeing that empty nature of thought really begins to give us the experience of its selfless nature, because there's hardly anything there. So that's another way of beginning to understand what being identified with the thought is, which means really being identified with the content. And not being identified is when we're not concerned with the content, but seeing the very nature of thought.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much freedom on the other side of that. You're cutting the strings of a malevolent puppeteer.
Yeah.
That being said, just a categorization question. Is what you're talking about here, this non-identification with thoughts, is that part of mundane right view or super mundane right view?
No, that would be more in the super mundane, because another part of this more super mundane, or I don't know, we might call it liberative right view. One other aspect beside the Four Noble Truths, but contained within that, are the three characteristics of impermanence, dukkha, and selflessness. And so to the degree that we're seeing the non-self aspect of phenomena, the impersonality of them, so it becomes on this level of right view. And it's tremendously freeing, as one teacher expressed it, no self, no problem. Big self, big problem. So right view is just, it's foundational. And just one little kind of footnote to all this. In the Eightfold Path, as you know, every one of the steps is, the prefix is right. Right view, right thought, right speech, right action, and so forth. So what the right refers to in each of the other steps, like right mindfulness. And people might ask, well, what's wrong mindfulness? If mindfulness means relating in the skillful way. Well, the right, in terms of the steps of the Eightfold Path, always refers to, is that particular step in alignment with right view? Mm-hmm. If it's in alignment with right view, then all the other steps are right. But you could have concentration, for example, not in alignment with right view, or effort, not in alignment. So then it's not right effort or right concentration. I didn't understand that for a long time, but that's what the right actually referred to. So the right view becomes the foundation for then really understanding more completely what each of the remaining steps on the path are about.
And I just want to go back to mundane and super mundane. I apologize for continuing to beat this dead horse, but I want to make sure that I get it, and by extension, everybody listening. Mundane is really about, day to day, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Also conditional, conventional.
Yes.
It's like what are the actual ways of producing ordinary states of happiness?
Right.
Yes.
Whereas, or the causes and conditions for good experiences.
And super mundane is about transcending all of that and waking up.
Yeah. But there's one other, the way the Buddha described mundane right view, which, and I wish I could remember it precisely, but so there's kind of a paraphrase as best I can remember, but he describes right view associated with taints, associated with basically defilements of one kind or another, because there could be mundane right view still associated with greed, with wanting. In the Buddhist world, there's quite a lot of emphasis on making merit, which is kind of a colloquial way of describing the law of karma. It's recognizing, yes, certain things bring good results. And that process is colloquially called making merit. And making merit in English, it has a lot of connotations that can be problematic. But one of the ways it was characterized is creating provisions for the journey. And I love that. It's like, yeah, we're doing those actions. We're all on this journey, this long journey towards enlightenment through samsara. Do we want to be well provisioned on the journey or not? And that was the description of merit. But you can see that, that can come with taints, with attachment. And that's why it's mundane right view. It is right view because it will bring those good results. Right? But there can still be a wanting in that. The super mundane right view cuts through the wanting, the craving. But to me, it was reassuring to read about right view with taints and right view without taints, because there was plenty of taints to be observed, in even doing skillful acts, knowing, this is going to have a good result.
An act of generosity can be polluted by some attachment or some ulterior motive, but it's nevertheless better than no act of generosity.
Exactly. So that I think is good for people to know, because sometimes they think, unless their motivation is totally pure, then something's not worth doing. But this allows for every level of it. So the description of right view really provides a great foundation for every other step on the path.
Nice. Well, we got to, it feels like we got right view, and we've got 7 other folds of the path. So
I was just doing the math in my head. So two a day.
Two a day leaves us with 1 more to do, because we've only done 1 today.
Well, some will be
faster
than right view is.
Yeah.
Very full. Right. And some of the others are really full, but this one has a lot in it.
For an 80-year-old, your energy levels in this conversation seem fantastic.
Where's the 8-year-old come from?
I said for an 8-year-old. Your energy.
80.
Yeah.
I thought you said 8.
Yeah. Or for an 8-year-old. Yeah. For an 8-year-old, you're terrible.
Yeah. For an 8-year-old, you are terrible.
You're hypoglycemic.
I was trying. For an 8-year-old, I didn't quite know how to interpret that. It is the magic of the Dharma. It really is. Like in teaching, I can be exhausted. And then starts coming through, and it's amazing. And then the collapse with the gin and tonic.
You did hit upon the what I still think is the most astounding quality of the mind, which is unexamined thoughts are everything, and examined they're basically nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that.
Yeah.
And there's almost no tradition in the West, in philosophy or psychology or to say nothing of actual hard science, that even acknowledges that fact. Right? Like there's just like that fact has gone unnoticed by the West.
I've spoken at some conferences of basically therapist types and psychologists and so. And when I talk about this, like, to look at what is a thought, not what is the thought saying, which of course, what the thought is saying is their whole world.
Right. Yeah.
For some few people, it really is like, whoa, people have come, reflected back to me. Right. Boy, that's a whole different thing.
It's everything.
Absolutely, it is everything.
This is the profound asymmetry between West and East on this contemplative point. It's like most people in the West have never even thought about an alternative to just thinking about everything.
Exactly. We're in our stories. Yeah. We are completely in our stories.
Yeah.
As you know, that there's this wonderful phrase in the Tibetan teachings, how with this kind of awareness, thoughts self-liberate.
Yeah.
That's just what it's like. The thought is there and it self-liberates.
That's also my favorite image from the Tibetan teachings about this, is that the 3 stages of self-liberation, the first is like writing on water. Right. It just vanishes the moment you do it. The second is the snake untying a knot, the knotted snake untying itself. But the third is the image I actually like, which is thieves entering an empty house.
Right.
That just shows you that
Yes.
recognize there's just no implication to their appearance.
Thanks again to Joseph and Sam. If you want to hear the rest of this excellent series on the Eightfold Path, as well as the guided meditations that go along with it, go to wakingup.com/10%. I put a link in the show notes. And just a reminder, if you buy a subscription via that URL, you'll get 30 days free, and you will be doing me and my team a solid because we will get a portion of any proceeds from the subscriptions that are generated through that link. And as I said earlier, if money's an issue, don't worry about it. You can go to the Waking Up website and ask for a scholarship. That's the same policy I have over at danharris.com. If you can't afford it, we'll hook you up. And again, to be a little repetitive here, I really do think about Waking Up as a great complement to my Substack. If you're looking for a community vibe, the ability to chat directly with me, the ability to listen to this podcast without ads, Substack is your spot. If you're looking for more of a traditional meditation app experience, Waking Up is awesome. As I said at the top, Sam has really brought together an amazing group of teachers over there, including Joseph. And don't forget that 30-part lecture series that you can listen to through wakingup.com/10%. Just before I go here, I want to thank everybody who worked so hard to make this show. Our producers are Tara Anderson, Caroline Keenan, and Eleanor Vasili. Our recording and engineering is handled by the great folks over at Pod People. Lauren Smith is our production manager. Marissa Schneiderman is our senior producer. DJ Kashmir is our executive producer. And Nick Thorburn of the band Islands wrote our theme.